In this video, we are going to continue on with our discussion with international trade and talk about four things: terms of trade, exchange rate, international competitiveness, and trade liberalization. So first, let's look at terms of trade. So terms of trade is defined as the weighted average price received by exporters relative to the weighted average price paid by importers. So it is calculated as the export price index divided by the import price index. So terms of trade, TOT. So this is how you calculate terms of trade. The absolute values of terms of trade is not important, but the trend of terms of trade is important. So if the terms of trade increase, then this means we are receiving more money per unit of export relative to import. So whether it goes from 100 to 105 or 10 to 15, the absolute value is not really important. The trend is important. So we look at how terms of trade increased and decreased and their impact on the economy. We do not necessarily care about the absolute value of terms of trade. So what happens when we have a high terms of trade or higher terms of trade? So this indicates exports or export firms receiving more revenue per unit of export. So this is really important. It's per unit of export, because terms of trade is like a price. We do not talk about the overall revenue or the overall volume of export. We are talking about the price per unit or revenue per unit of export. And another possibility is they paid lower for any given number of imports. So this is also important because we are talking about this relative movement. So terms of trade can increase if the import price becomes lower. It can also increase if the export price becomes higher. But both of this movement would be reflected as a higher terms of trade or an increase in terms of trade. So what is the significance of lower price of imports or higher price of exports? So this is another related topic. So both the imports and exports for Australian goods or services. So examples of imports include intermediate products such as steel, etc. Exports usually minerals, so oil, gas, iron ore, things like that, as well as education. So all those things have a common characteristic. They have a low price elasticity of demand. And this means if we have a fall in import price, so a fall in price of intermediate products, then the demand would not increase much. Because let's think about what stuff Australia imports. Imports cars, imports stationaries, imports computers, phones, laptops, clothing, things like that. If the price falls, you are not going to purchase another car. So generally speaking, they have low price elasticity of demand. So when price falls, demand would not increase as much. And this would result in cost savings. So you are overall spending less money than before because the price is lower and your consumption remains relatively the same. So this would reduce, in other words, reduce debits relative to credits. Remember, debits is money going out, credit money going in. Since you are spending relatively less money on imports, you are reducing debits relative to credits. So more money is actually coming in. So this would cause increase in credits in net good and net services channel of the current account. So that's how you link terms of trade with current account balance, and thus increase current account surplus or decrease current account deficit. So this is how you link terms of trade with current account. It's because we have this low price elasticity of demand for export and import. And for export, it's the same. If the price of export have increased, since we export education, services, oil, gas, those things are relatively speaking necessities. So the price increase, but the demand does not decrease by as much as increase in price. So you have a higher money coming in relative to money going out. So this means you are increasing the credits, and thus increase the current account surplus or decrease current account deficit. So a caveat to be careful of. So if the rise in terms of trade is driven by lower efficiency, so because of low productivity, Australian exports are getting more expensive. This is bad for the economy. So it's not the case that higher terms of trade is positive. We need to know why does terms of trade increased, and if it's increased because of low efficiency of the Australia's workforce, then it is very bad news, because your exports become very uncompetitive in the global market, and this would cause the economy to shrink, and also increase imports, which would decrease the current account surplus. So this is terms of trade, and students usually confuse this with the next topic, which is exchange rate. This is measured by something called trade weighted index, or TWI for short. So the trade weighted index is like inflation. It's calculated very similarly, so it is also a weighted average exchange rate of all Australia's major trading partners. So you know that we have many different currency pairs. We can have AUD, USD, AUD, EUR, AUD, JPY. So against US dollar, the euro, the Japanese yen. But how do we kind of combine them together into a single number so it's easier for people to understand? We use the trade weighted index. So we look at the trade Australia conduct with the overseas economies, and whoever is the most important partner will get a higher weighting in the trade-weighted index. So, because Australia like to trade with China, the currency pair Australian dollar versus the Chinese yuan is the biggest component of Australia's trade-weighted index. So, a small fluctuation in the AUD-CNY exchange rate would have a bigger impact on the trade-weighted index than changes in the value of Australian dollar against the US dollar. So that's different concept to terms of trade. Terms of trade is the price you have received for exports and imports, but trade-weighted index is the calculation of exchange rate in the economy. So although they have all started with trade, or have trade in it, they are completely irrelevant topics. So let's look at some of the things that can impact the exchange rate or can impact the trade-weighted index. So the first factor is the relative inflation rate. So higher inflation relative to trading partners will cause the international market abandon Australia goods. So a decrease in international competitiveness. And this decrease exports, increase imports. So exports is the demand for Australian dollar. Because if the foreigners wants to purchase Australian goods, which is exports, they need to pay in terms of Australian dollar. Or maybe they pay in US dollar, but it's ultimately exchanged to Australian dollar. So in this case, if exports decreases due to a higher price or higher rate of inflation relative to the rest of the world, then we would have a lower demand for the Australian dollar. Similarly, for imports, you need to convert your currency to maybe Chinese yuan, Japanese yen, or euro when you buy stuff from foreign buyers. And this represents the supply. You need to sell the Australian dollar in order to get foreign currencies. And the currency market, or the FX, the foreign exchange market, operates exactly the same way as all the markets you have studied in macroeconomics. It is the interaction of demand and supply. And the exchange rate is determined by demand and supply. So if you have less demand and more supply, this would cause depreciation of the Australian dollar. And depreciation is a special term for currency market. So it means value goes down. So the Australian dollar is worth less, which is reflected as a lower trade-weighted index. So that's the first reason that can impact the value of Australian dollar. Obviously, if you have a lower rate of inflation relative to trading partners, then the Australian dollar is expected to appreciate. The second, which is the most important factor, is the relative interest rate. So, a higher relative interest rate in Australia means that Australian dollar assets, so like bonds, deposits, can earn a higher return. So because Australian dollar assets can earn higher return, it becomes more attractive to overseas investors. And because it's more attractive, then there's more demand, because you need to convert your own currency to Australian dollar before investing in Australia. So you have more demand for Australian dollars. And this would increase the value for AUD, which is called appreciation. Conversely, if relative interest rate in Australia is lower, then Australian dollar assets become less attractive. So domestic investors would sell Australian dollar to invest overseas. So this can increase supply for the dollar and thus decrease the value of Australian dollar, causing depreciation. The next factor is the overseas economic growth. So if we have a slow growth in major trading partner like China, this means less demand iron ore for coal. So coal is used to generate electricity. The usage of electricity will decrease when the economy is slowing down, and the iron ore is used for construction. So if construction is slowing down in a slow economy, this would decrease the price of coal and iron ore. So it will cause a drop in price and a drop in demand. So this means less demand for Australian dollar, because the Chinese need to convert their money to Australian dollar and then to purchase Australian-made goods and services. And because we have less demand and as well as lower price, we have less demand for the Australian dollar as well. And this would cause a depreciation. And this is the major reason why the Australian dollar have depreciated so much during this year, because of slow growth in China. Even though if you look at the relative interest rate, Australia is actually higher than other economies like Canada. So now let's look at the effect of exchange rate on the macroeconomic goals, living standards, and current account. So let's focus on the case of appreciation. For depreciation, you just flip the story. So appreciation of the Australian dollar means that the Australian-made goods and services becomes more expensive. So that's a different causation to a more cheaper Australian goods causes appreciation of the dollar. Now we are talking about another story. So the appreciation of Australian dollar itself would make Australian-made goods and services more expensive. So why is this the case? So if you are Australian sellers, you want to get Australian dollar. So suppose you want to sell one pen for $2. But because the value of Australian dollar have increased, then from a foreign buyer's perspective, they need to pay more. Before, maybe they pay 1.5 US dollar for the pen. But now, since Australian dollar have increased in value, they need to pay 1.7 US dollars, even though you are still receiving 2 Australian dollars. And this would mean that Australian-made goods and services becomes relatively more expensive. And this is bad for the economy. So that's why countries like their currency to depreciate, because it can increase the price competitiveness of their exports. So goods and services becomes more expensive, a decrease in international competitiveness, and thus decrease export, increase imports. And this, remember, shift the AD to the left, because it is one of the factors of AD. and this would cause increase in inventories and thus less demand for labor, and less production. So this can increase the unemployment rate. So not good for the goal of full employment. We have less production, which decreases the GDP growth rate, which is not good for the goal of strong and sustainable economic growth. However, because we have appreciation of Australian dollar, the cost for imports would decrease. And this reduces cost inflation. And reduction in cost inflation means we have decrease in inflation rate. Also, I guess lower AD would reduce demand inflation as well. So we actually can achieve a lower inflation rate if the Australian dollar appreciates. And this could potentially be good for the goal of low inflation. So now let's link this with living standards. So less GDP, we know that GDP production is equal to GDP income by the accounting identity, and lower income means lower purchasing power for households. Lower purchasing power reduces material living standards. Since you are unable to access as much goods and services you may be able to access before. Also, a higher unemployment may cause a decrease in non-material living standards, because unemployment is generally associated with a higher chance of depression, financial insecurity, things like that, which decrease the happiness of life, thus decrease the non-material living standards. Also, how do you link this lower GDP with current account? So because we have a decrease in the international competitiveness due to this higher value of Australian dollar, then this means we have less exports and more imports, because things become relatively more expensive from foreigners' perspective, and from domestic buyers' perspective, imports become more attractive because Australian dollar is worth more. And less exports means less credit, so less money coming in. More imports means more debit, more money going out. And this means we have less net goods and less net services. And this decreases current account surplus or increases current account deficit. So overall, it's not really good for an increase for the current account, because you are spending more money than before relative to the case of a lower Australian dollar. And as you can see, there is a clear incentive for national governments to depress their exchange rate, to make the exchange rate lower, which can stimulate the economy. And that's why countries, especially developing countries, likes to manipulate their currencies to make it artificially lower, which can encourage economic growth. The next topic related to international trade is called international competitiveness. So this refers to the ability for Australian firms to compete in global markets for goods and services. So essentially, how well Australian firms can compete against their international counterparts or their international competitors. So there are some factors that can affect the international competitiveness, which you need to know. The first factor is the relative inflation rate. So I guess we have already touched on this point before when we talk about how relative inflation rate affects the exchange rate, but it can also affect the international competitiveness. So so suppose if Australia higher relative inflation rate than, for example, China, then this will make Australian products less competitive. So why is that? Because the price of Australian made goods and services is rising faster. So this means the relative price is actually increasing than the price of Chinese product. And this decrease the net goods, net services, and decrease debit, increase credits, which also increases current account deficits. Or if you have a current account surplus, decrease the current account surplus. So this is basically the relative price. But when we talk about international trade, we use the term relative inflation rate, because for macroeconomics, we don't talk about price, we talk about inflation rate, which is just another measure of price. Exchange rate is also a factor. So I have already talked about this before. So the notion of exchange rate is that, so for example, the Australian seller wants to receive $1 Australian. But this is not important from foreign buyers' perspective. They don't care how much Australian dollar they want. They go to the website and then find out what is $1 Australian in terms of their own currencies. For example, sometimes it may worth 70 US cents. Sometimes it was 60 US cents. So this represents a depreciation. So whenever Australian dollar depreciates, then the Australian-made goods and services becomes relatively more attractive from overseas buyers' perspective. Because before they are paying 70 cents, but now they are only paying 60 cents. And you are still receiving $1 Australian. So the depreciation of currency alone can increase the level of international competitiveness. And that's also another reason why countries like to engage in exchange rate manipulation by making their currency lower, so by depreciating their currency. The third factor is, so there's actually three other factors, but I think you can put them together into one factor. So it's productivity, cost of production, and availability of resources. So that's all from the producer's point of view. And what those three factors have in common is they all affects the cost of production. So a higher productivity will ultimately leads to a decrease in cost of production. And more abundant resources would also cause a decrease in cost of production, because the resources is cheaper. So all those decreases the average cost of production. And so for the same profit, firms can sell cheaper. And by selling cheaper, this leads nicely to the first factor, the relative inflation rate. And so, therefore, the relative price of Australian-made goods and services becomes cheaper. So the international competitiveness would increase. The final topic with regard to this trade section is called trade liberalization. So this refers to, this topic a few years before is very popular. Countries like to engage in trade liberalization, but now we are kind of going in the opposite direction. But it's still good to know about this topic. So it's the removal of protectionist policies, such as tariffs. So tariffs is a tax on imports. So by having tariffs, what you are doing is to distort this natural price level. So you are artificially kind of increase the relative price of imports. So to make your locally make goods and services more attractive. Or if you don't impose tariff, you can impose import quotas. So overall, during 1 year time, you can only import 100,000 cars from Japan. So that's one example of import quota. For tariffs, all the Chinese-made electric cars would have a tariff of 100%. So that's tariff. So if the car is worth $20,000, the tax would also be $20,000. So the price to consumers, instead of 20,000, becomes 40,000. So that's how tariffs can decrease the attractiveness of foreign-made goods and services. The aim is to promote free movement of goods and services across international borders and to increase competition domestically. So instead of protecting domestic firms, we want to increase competition, because domestic firms not only need to compete against themselves, but also compete against foreign or international firms. So this can have different effects on short term and long term. So short term, the effect is usually bad for domestic firms. So either cheaper or high quality foreign-made goods and services reduce market for domestic firms. So this means increase in import, decrease in exports. So the ultimate effect is to reduce net export. So this would shift AD to the left. And the result is a lower GDP growth. And because of lower GDP growth, we have less demand for labor, so a higher cyclical unemployment. Please refer to my video of full employment for the definition of cyclical unemployment. But this leads to something very interesting. So to protect so this means domestic businesses the local firms, because they are starts to lose market shares, so are incentivized to increase their efficiency. Or productivity. So this can be done by, for example, using robots. But this can also cause some type of structural unemployment. So because human labor are replaced by robotics, some people may permanently unable to find their jobs that match their skill sets. So those type of unemployment are called structural unemployment. And all those processes, because it's cheaper, would reduce inflation. So it's good for the goal of low inflation, because the cheaper imports can reduce inflation, and higher unemployment can also reduce demand inflation. So the lower GDP growth is not compatible with the goal of SSEG, and higher structural unemployment is not compatible with the goal of full employment, but it is compatible with the goal of low inflation. So that's what would happen in the short term. The more interesting things happens in the medium to long term. So a higher productivity of Australian firms would cause a decrease in cost of production. So local firms' profit would increase. And we know that cost of production is actually an aggregate supply factor. So firms are more willing and able to produce, thus shift the aggregate supply to the right and increase productive capacity. And because of lower cost of production, local firms are able to reduce their price, and this increases international competitiveness and means higher exports. So this is also cause increase in aggregate demand, because export is a component of aggregate demand. And higher aggregate demand decreases, so it's already very familiar now, decreases inventory, which encourages production. And this would cause increase in demand for labor. Higher demand for labor means lower cyclical unemployment. And also more production means higher GDP growth. So in the long term, this is compatible with the goal of SSEG, compatible with the goal of full employment, and also compatible with the goal of low inflation. So that's why we encourage international trade. Although we have pain in the short term, but in the long term, we are able to achieve all three domestic macroeconomic goals simultaneously.